the altar of empire. At some point, the church stopped serving God and started serving the throne. It began in shadows, a persecuted faith, hiding in catacombs, whispering prayers in secret. Then one day, everything changed. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. It sounded like a miracle. No more hiding, no more fear. But freedom came with a price. Rome didn't just tolerate the church, it absorbed it. What once was a rebel movement became the moral backbone of empire. Temples were turned into cathedrals. Bishops were treated like Roman officials. And the church, once the voice of the poor, began dining with emperors. Suddenly, robes got heavier, rings got larger, and altars grew tall like thrones. The message of Christ was no longer about the meek, it was about the mighty. The church didn't just inherit power, it craved it. Over time, it crowned kings, launched wars, and collected taxes. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual guide, he became a ruler with lands, armies, and laws. Faith was no longer something you chose, it was something enforced. Whole populations were converted at sword point, not through love, but through fear. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the conquest of the Americas, these weren't acts of faith. They were campaigns of empire wrapped in sacred robes. The church justified slaughter, slavery, and conquest, all from the altar. They told warriors they were saving souls while destroying bodies. They promised heaven to those who killed in the name of Christ. But Christ never asked for empires. He never demanded gold. He never built palaces. He rode donkeys, not war horses. He washed feet, not hands of blood. The church betrayed him, not once, but again and again, by kneeling at the feet of power. And even today, the echo remains. The Vatican is a sovereign city-state. The Pope meets with presidents. The church holds billions in wealth while preaching poverty. Opulence sits side by side with scripture. The altar of empire was never torn down. It was polished and preserved. But beneath the gold and glory, something is missing. Where are the hungry being fed? Where are the outcasts being welcomed? Where is the wildfire of love that once spread through the streets? The church became the empire it once resisted, and like all empires, it now fears collapse. But true faith doesn't collapse, only institutions do. If Catholicism is to rise again, not as machinery, not as dogma, not as empire, but as spirit, it must return to its roots, not to power, but to presence, not to doctrine, but to the divine, not to thrones, but to truth. The altar must be emptied of empire. Only then can it be filled with God, the assembled religion. Imagine taking parts from 10 different creatures and sewing them together to create one powerful beast. That's what happened to form Catholicism. It's not one pure tradition, it's a mix, a mosaic, a religious Frankenstein. Catholicism is not just Christianity, it's part Judaism, part Roman paganism, part Greek philosophy, part Egyptian mysticism, and part political strategy. If it were a car, it would have Jewish wheels, Roman engines, Egyptian decorations, and Greek software. No wonder it has contradictions. Let's break down some of these pieces. From Judaism, Catholicism took the idea of one God, the scriptures, the 10 Commandments, and the concept of a chosen people. But then it twisted them. The Jewish Sabbath was Saturday. Catholics changed it to Sunday, aligning with the Roman sun god. The Jewish avoidance of idols was thrown out completely. Catholicism filled its churches with statues, candles, and images. From Roman paganism, Catholicism borrowed festivals, architecture, titles, and even clothing. Cardinals' red robes, inspired by Roman senators, incense and processions, straight from Roman temples. Prayers to saints resemble Roman prayers to household gods. Each saint even had a specialty, just like Roman deities. You pray to Saint Anthony if you've lost something, just like you'd pray to Mercury for communication, or Hermes for guidance. From Greek philosophy, especially Plato and Aristotle, Catholicism inherited abstract ideas about the soul, heaven, and divine forms. These were not part of the original Hebrew worldview. Jesus spoke in parables, not in philosophical arguments. But Catholic scholars like Augustine and Aquinas tried to fuse Greek logic with spiritual doctrine, and this created a religion that could argue endlessly about the nature of the Trinity or the metaphysics of the Eucharist. From Egypt, Catholicism absorbed symbols, rituals, and mythologies. The concept of the afterlife, judgment, paradise, and purgatory existed in Egyptian beliefs long before Catholic theology. The idea of a Holy Virgin giving birth to a god was not new. It existed in the myths of Isis and Horus. The similarity is striking. And what about the political machinery? Catholicism built a hierarchy that mirrored the Roman government. Pope, cardinals, bishops, priests. It was a spiritual empire. And like any empire, it controlled people not only through belief, but through fear. The idea of eternal damnation, of hell, of purgatory, these were tools used to ensure obedience. Confession became a way to monitor moral behavior. Excommunication was worse than death. It meant eternal separation from God. This Frankenstein faith was carefully crafted to cover all bases. It had the mystery of mysticism, the logic of philosophy, the rituals of paganism, the stories of the Bible, and the authority of empire. It was designed not just to inspire, but to control. And for centuries, it worked. People kneeled in front of what they thought was the truth, but what they were really worshipping was an assembled machine, built for domination. Even the Bible itself was edited and assembled by the Catholic Church. Dozens of Gospels were removed. Books were voted in and out. The final list of inspired texts was chosen by bishops who had political motives. The Gospel of Mary, gone. The Gospel of Thomas, too mystical. The Book of Enoch, too strange. Only the texts that supported the emerging power structure were allowed to survive. The rest were burned, banned, or buried. What remained was a controlled narrative, carefully cleaned, strategically edited, and sealed with a stamp of divine authority. But it wasn't pure. It wasn't original. It was assembled. That's the real horror of this Frankenstein religion. It doesn't even hide its stitches. The symbols are right there. The contradictions are clear. And yet, the machine keeps moving. The strategic Christ. They took a rebel, a mystic, a carpenter's son, and turned him into a weapon of empire. Jesus of Nazareth preached against the systems of power. He flipped tables in temples, walked with outcasts, and defied religious authorities. But the Christ of Catholicism, that figure looks nothing like the dangerous teacher who challenged Rome. This new Christ, wrapped in gold, seated on a throne, holding the keys to heaven, was crafted not for revolution, but for control. The church didn't just follow Jesus, it redesigned him. In the Gospels, Jesus is an outsider. He tells the rich to give up everything. He says the kingdom of God is within. He distrusts religious ritual. He criticizes the Pharisees. But as the church grew in power, these teachings became inconvenient. So they were edited, reinterpreted, or overshadowed by new narratives. Ones that made Jesus less of a revolutionary and more of a divine emperor. Constantine the Great saw the potential of this. In 312 AD, he had a vision, a cross in the sky and the words, "In this sign, conquer." That moment changed everything. Christianity went from a persecuted movement to a state religion. But it had to change. The radical message of Christ had to be reshaped into something that supported power, not challenged it. Christ became a king. Churches were built like palaces. Bishops dressed like Roman senators. The humble man from Galilee was recast as a ruler, a judge, a cosmic emperor. The strategic Christ was born, not to liberate, but to rule. The image of Jesus on the cross, once a symbol of suffering, became a throne of glory. The meek Messiah was transformed into the divine enforcer. The emphasis shifted from his teachings to his blood, from his life to his death, from his words to his sacrifice. Why? Because it's easier to control people through guilt than through wisdom. A suffering Christ creates obedient followers. A living teacher creates dangerous questions. The Catholic Christ became the gatekeeper of salvation. You couldn't reach him directly. You needed priests, sacraments, rituals. The Church placed itself between humanity and the divine, using Christ as the doorway and themselves as the key holders. This was strategy. Jesus said the kingdom was within. The Church said the kingdom was theirs. Jesus forgave freely. The Church made forgiveness a ritual transaction. Jesus taught in the open. The Church locked truth in Latin books, guarded by clergy. This new Christ became the figurehead of conquest. Under his name, crusades were launched. Heretics were burned. Kingdoms were colonized. The same man who said, "Love your enemies," became the banner for slaughter. This was not accidental. It was political genius. Every empire needs a God on its side. The strategic Christ was crafted to be that God. And yet, despite the manipulation, something real still flickers. Beneath the layers of gold and doctrine, the original Jesus still calls out. But he is hard to hear over the chants, the incense, the centuries of control. The Church turned the Son of Man into a symbol of submission. But the real Christ, if we dare to seek him, is a challenge to every throne. The strategic Christ is not who he claimed to be. He is who the Church needed him to be. And that's the real Frankenstein, where it all began. It didn't begin with Jesus. That's the first shocker for most people raised in Catholic households. The story of Catholicism begins not in Bethlehem, but in Rome. And not with love and peace, but with power and empire. What we now call Catholicism is not the religion Jesus practiced or preached. It's something that came centuries later, twisted and shaped by emperors, politicians, and power-hungry bishops who needed religion to serve their goals. To understand Catholicism, we need to understand the Roman Empire. In the first few centuries after Christ's death, Christians were a small, scattered, persecuted minority. They had no buildings, no official doctrine, no centralized power. They worshipped in homes, caves, forests, anywhere they could avoid the Roman authorities who saw them as a threat. But then came Constantine. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of a cross before battle, followed by a victory. He converted to Christianity, at least politically, and suddenly, Christianity was not just tolerated, it became official. But Constantine didn't convert to the humble, rebellious Christianity of the early followers. He needed a religion that would unite his empire. So he began mixing, shaping, and assembling a version of Christianity that would work for Rome. This was the beginning of something Frankenstein-like, a stitched-together faith made from different parts, ideologies, and gods. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, called by Constantine himself, was the first major step. At that council, bishops were ordered to agree on key doctrines. Many of these ideas had never been agreed upon by Jesus or his apostles. Trinity, virgin birth, divinity of Christ. These weren't universally accepted until they were voted on by men. Men in political robes, rather than spiritual ones. But even deeper, we see Roman customs infiltrating the faith. Roman holidays were rebranded with Christian names. December 25th, originally a pagan festival of the sun god Sol Invictus, became Christmas. Statues of Roman gods were renamed and used as images of saints. Temples were repurposed into churches. The Pope was modelled after the Roman Pontifex Maximus, a title used by Caesar himself. So Catholicism didn't begin with a pure spiritual message. It began with empire. It began with politics. It began with a man who needed to hold a crumbling empire together and found that religion was a powerful tool. Christianity was reshaped not to reflect Christ, but to reflect Rome. What's worse, the original teachings of Jesus about simplicity, poverty, inner purity were buried under layers of rituals, hierarchy, and power structures. Bishops wore golden robes while preaching about humility. Popes lived in palaces while claiming to follow a man who had no home. The message had been stolen and replaced with a system. This theft of the message didn't stop there. As Catholicism grew, it absorbed more from the surrounding cultures. Egyptian symbols like the Ankh were rebranded into the Christian cross. The mother-child depictions of Isis and Horus were transformed into Mary and baby Jesus. The rituals of Mithras, an ancient Roman god worshipped by soldiers, resembled the Catholic Mass. Bread, wine, a sacred altar, and even resurrection myths. By the time we reached the Middle Ages, Catholicism had become unrecognizable from its supposed origin. Jesus, a rebel against the system, had been turned into a symbol used by the system. The religion became a tool of kings, crusaders, and inquisitors. The church held not just spiritual authority, but legal and economic power. It could tax, imprison, and even kill. And yet people were told this was the true faith, the only faith, the path to heaven. But the roots tell another story. Catholicism, from its very beginning, was not born in the spirit of freedom and truth. It was born in strategy. It was assembled, altered, and weaponized. That is where it all began.